Welcome everyone to this first in a three-part series on responsible AI. My name is Jessica Wyndham and I direct the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law program at AAAS. We're pleased to serve as host of this series, and I thank also Hitachi for their sponsorship. A review of articles published in AAAS reveals, as one of our guests said to me before we began, this field is very wide and very deep, from how humans and animals do it to algorithms and applications. We see articles in facial recognition as a tool being used by social media companies, its deployment as a surveillance instrument, but also its value as a technology to improve scientific research of animals, from lemurs to sheep to chimpanzees. To review this background, we'll provide links in the comments section. Today, we'll be focusing on what the technology is and is not, at least not yet, and the ethical, legal, and social implications of the development and use of the technology on humans. I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Phillips from the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Information Technology Laboratory. A foremost expert on facial recognition, he designs grand challenges for advancing face recognition and visual biometric technology in science. He's published more than 100 papers and is one of the field's most cited researchers. Also joining us is Nima Singh Guliani of the American Civil Liberties Union, where she focuses on surveillance, privacy, and national security issues. Prior to joining the ACLU, she worked in the Chief of Staff's office at the Department of Homeland Security, concentrating on national security and civil liberties. She's an expert in facial recognition technology and its impact on civil rights and liberties, including having provided testimony on the topic on Capitol Hill. The format of our discussion today will be an interview with our guests with time for questions from our audience. So please use the chat function to post your questions for our guests, including your name, and if you'd like, let us know where you're connecting in from. So to get us started, I want to pose a question first to you, Jonathan. What is it that facial recognition can do currently? And what are near-term developments and what is really pie in the sky?
So one of the things we've done at NIST is we've done a series of evaluations. So we know how well the technology works. And this information is made available to the public on our websites. So recently we've done an evaluation. The reports released in 2018. We had a data set of 12 million mugshot images. Then we take an image of a person we know is 12 million, and we put it into the system. And we look at how often the person is the top match out of the 12 million. And the current best report we have is 99.7% of the time you get the top match back. So these are mugshots where we have portrait quality, high quality images. Work is still going on to look at where the field calls in the wild images. These are images that don't have variation of the head, the variation of the lighting, the pose, the angle. And this is still a current technology people are working on. The error rates are improving on a yearly basis for new technology. But here I think the numbers we make available, and this is to inform the policymakers of where you think the technology can meet particular requirements. And the last question you had was sort of pie in the sky. And people talk about recognizing faces through from great distances through windshields. I think that's still pie in the sky, and I would hold my breath to showing on independent tests whether these types of technologies will work and are viable.
Thank you. And welcome to one of our audience members, Esteban, who told us he's calling in from or connecting in from Germany. So Jonathan, when you talk about accuracy, can you explain what accuracy actually means in the context of face recognition? How should we understand that term?
So the accuracy varies from application to application, but the core one is what we would call a single detection problem. Or verification. So if I go to my bank account or some account and want to say, I want to hit, and I say, I'm Jonathan Phillips. It compares my face image to another image. So there are two types of errors that can happen. One is I'm actually Jonathan trying to get in, and if it lets me in, we call that a successful verification or given access. The other one is I can go in and say I'm somebody else. And this type of error is if it lets me in, that's known as a false alarm or a false accept. So the big question you have is, where do you set the system, what's known as the operating point? So one extreme, I can let nobody in which case I have no false alarms, but my verification is zero, so it's not very useful. At the other end of the extreme, I can let everybody in which case I never miss a verification, but I have a 100% false alarm or false accept rate. And where a system operates depends. So one standard operating point we use for evaluation is a false alarm at 1 in 1,000. So in which case I would say somebody can impersonate Jonathan 1 out of 1,000 times, but the question is how often does it let me in? And where you set it depends on what your application is and how sensitive it is. But the important point here is there's always a trade-off between basically letting somebody in who's not allowed in versus giving somebody access who's not allowed to. And this generalizes, for example, this trade-off if you're doing some sort of watch list for looking for people. So the key point for accuracy is what's the trade-off between these two type of errors.
Okay, so talking about trade-offs and the implications of a less than 100% accurate system, I have a question for each of you. So, Jonathan, what are the implications from a scientific or technical perspective of there being less than 100% accuracy?
So, as people are algorithm developers, the technical point of view is how do you design the algorithm to work as best as possible, particularly at a fixed setting. So the goal is to improve the technology to address that question. And as we said, we've done evaluations for over now 25 years. And what we've seen usually is technology improves, and it tends to improve in reducing both type of errors as the technologies evolve over time.
Okay, thank you. And Nima, thinking of the context in which these technologies applied to individuals and within society, what do you see as the implications for a less than 100% accuracy rate in the use of these technologies?
So one of the things I often say is that we're talking about imperfect technology and it's being deployed in a very imperfect environment. And so Jonathan touched base on the accuracy, but one of the things that has been shown with various studies with different algorithms is that face recognition technology is often less accurate on certain subgroups. For example, women of color is one of the subgroups for which the technology has often been shown to be the least accurate. And so I think we have to understand that we're talking about a technology that is fundamentally flawed, and those flaws may fall disproportionately on certain individuals, women, young people, other categories for which the technology is not very accurate. But those kinds of differences are amplified because I think what we're often seeing is this technology is also being deployed in context which have histories of bias and discrimination. So one of the debates that has been, on Capitol Hill and I think in the public writ large has been a question about law enforcement use of face recognition. And of course, we know due to many studies in various jurisdictions, there are biases with regards to how often people are stopped, how often they're arrested, even differences in incarceration based on factors like race and nationality. And so what you have is really the potential for this imperfect technology on its own to create problems, but then combined with the very imperfect context and in the hands of the very imperfect actors who are using the technology for those disparities to be further exacerbated. And I think worse than some of the problems that we all worry about, discrimination, disparities in this criminal justice system, problems that are enormous already that could just get worse.
Thank you. So building on that, again, a question for each of you. Jonathan, what are the current, if any, requirements on developers or distributors of these technologies to make clear the accuracy or accuracy rate of their technologies as they're going to be used?
So the way the community finds out or it becomes knowledgeable is the independent testing for characterizing performances along these accuracies. So at NIST, we have developed methodologies for measuring the effect on different demographic groups of their accuracy. So the way we drive this is we put methodologies out and also conduct tests that will measure and put reports out that characterize different subgroups and different factors. There's more than just the demographic groups. There's the imaging conditions, where it was taken that affect performance, so people understand the factors and how they affect them and how it can vary from algorithm to algorithm.
Thank you. Are you aware of any current requirements for those measurement tools to actually be used and the findings to be publicly released? Or is this a tool that you're providing that can be used but is not required to be?
So in our publications, we have methodologies and we show what we know and how to do it. There are two ways. One is independent reports, and the other is people using this, usually a lot of times researchers developing them or others to report their accuracy on these different groups using these methodologies or accepted best practice. What are best practices for analyzing algorithm accuracy?
Okay. And Nima, from your perspective, what do you think should be the requirements for developers, in many instances, the companies or the organizations that are developing these technologies, to be transparent about the biases that might be included in the systems or the level of accuracy of the technologies currently?
So I think that in many cases, we're putting the cart before the horse. Right. I think that there's a general acknowledgement that the risks and the concerns posed by face recognitions are really unique in terms of the fundamental threat to civil liberties, right? Concerns about face recognition being used and, for example, chilling people's First Amendment rights, right? Their right to protest, their right to sort of gather in public places. And so I think that while transparency around accuracy and the technology itself is important and crucial, one of the things we can't ignore is we have to have a larger societal debate about, do we want this technology used at all in certain contexts? And what does that process have to look like in a democratic society? One of the things that does concern me is when we look across the country, often what we're seeing are uses of the technology, certainly by the government, and in some cases by private actors, in situations where the public has never weighed in. We've never had a conversation about what should transparency look like, what protection should exist. Should there be sort of areas where the technology is not used at all because it poses such a fundamental threat? And so I do think that the conversation around transparency has to include a conversation about what are the processes that are required before certainly the government can use this technology, and how do we make sure that we're listening to the concerns of the individuals that are likely going to be most impacted, and what does that transparency look like?
So with that in mind, what are the current oversight and accountability structures built to address facial recognition, and what opportunities exist for public engagement to inform those or improved structures?
You know, unfortunately, I think certainly when it comes to government use of the technology, there's been a lack of sufficient oversight. And one of the reasons has been that the technology has often been used. For many years, it was not fully disclosed to the public, or there was very little information put out there. And it has not been done pursuant to sort of clear laws on the books after a public debate. So one of the things that the ACLU has been doing, at least at a state and local level, have been initiatives that are aimed at ensuring that anytime the government is using a new surveillance technology, they can't do so without clear legislation, clear standards, and the opportunity for public input. And I certainly think something like that is necessary before we start thinking about new uses of the technology or how it can be deployed in situations, in many cases, that have very real effects on people's lives. We should have a process that requires analysis, requires approval by legislative bodies, requires input from the public writ large, and certainly by individuals who are most likely to be impacted, and really a full analysis of what the effects are and how that comports with what we think of as values that are critical in a democratic society.
Thank you. We've had a question come in from one of our audience members. Arturo Vasquez has asked about the use of facial recognition technologies to help identify deepfakes, really applying one tool to its cousin, I suppose. Is this an application of facial recognition technology that is being developed, and if so, how effectively? Where are we in that development?
So the deep fakes, or in the AI, these are generated by generalized adversarial networks, is a new phenomenon coming on. Probably the most recent activity showing the importance of it, DARPA has announced a new program, Semaphore, which is designed to address fake imagery developed by these new AI techniques themselves. So I would say probably what comes out of that is a serious attempt to address the issue of, can you detect these fake face images, or particularly those developed by the new set of AI tools that are available to people.
Okay, thank you. And please, as a reminder, you can post your questions to our guests in the chat function on your Facebook page. I have a question that sort of stems from one of the particular interests of my program, which focuses on scientific responsibility, and it's a question for either of you, whoever feels, or both of you, whoever feels most comfortable in answering it. But given what we're discussing about accuracy, but also about the use of the technology per se, whether or not it's 100% accurate, what do you consider should be the responsibilities of developers in the development of these tools and in the transparency of information they provide about their capabilities? So focusing on the technologists who are actually developing these.
So certainly I think that there's definitely a responsibility and role for companies and individuals who are developing the technology to ensure that it's not used in ways that raise fundamental concerns. And so I would say that there's sort of, two or three suggestions I would have. I mean, I think, you talked about transparency and what's disclosed. I think it is very important that companies be very transparent and open about the risks of uses in certain contexts, right? And what that might mean, and frankly, whether the technology is even ready for some of the use cases that people have contemplated. But I think the other side of the coin is, companies taking steps and affirmatively deciding not to sell the technology for certain purposes. So one of the things that, we've asked of many major companies who sell face recognition technology, including Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, is to not sell the technology to the government because it's not ready for many of the applications and uses for which it's being contemplated, and it raises sort of fundamental privacy and civil liberties concerns that cannot be fully addressed. And so I do think that both halves of those, both of those issues are things that developers should keep in mind as they're thinking about what their responsibility is as they're developing this technology that could pose a threat to many people's lives and rights.
Thank you. We received a question here, which I think is probably mainly for you, Nima, from Esteban in Germany. What accuracy and level of sensitivity would be acceptable for the use of face recognition in the legal system, in your opinion?
Sure. So I think that even if the technology is 100% accurate, we still have concerns with the potential threat it could pose to civil liberties and rights. And we must have a broader debate about what it means to have this technology used in certain contexts. So for example, an example that came up in the US is use of face recognition technology to identify individuals who attend a protest. This happened in Baltimore, where police reportedly used face recognition on photos posted by protesters to social media accounts. That raises fundamental concerns. We also have to ask ourselves, what is the sort of societal effect of individuals knowing potentially that as they walk around in public, visit a doctor, go to an AA meeting, that potentially they can be identified? These aren't just accuracy concerns. They're concerns that strike fundamentally at questions around freedom of movement and the freedom to move around anonymously and free from government identification. And so I don't think that the debate is just a question of how do we make this technology accurate. The debate is about, is there really anything we can do to address the fundamental threats that use of this technology poses, certainly in the hands of law enforcement and immigration enforcement officials.
So we had a question about whether you consider it premature or a necessary step to do what some cities have already done in Massachusetts and in California, to ban the use by local governments of facial recognition. I think from what you're saying, then you would consider this a necessary step, but I don't want to put words into your mouth. Do you consider that premature, or is it necessary for us to be banning the use, at least currently, until these technologies are better understood and there's more democratic involvement in deciding how and when they're used?
Absolutely not. The ACLU has locally was supportive of both of those efforts. I don't think the technology is ready for prime time, and certainly not in the use cases it's been contemplated in the law enforcement and other very sensitive contexts. And certainly I am concerned and disturbed, frankly, that for many years the technology has been used in certain jurisdictions with very little transparency, very little public involvement, and very little information or analysis about the potential effects. And so we're very much supportive, I think, of the efforts in California and Massachusetts to put in place to prevent the technology from being used, particularly given the fundamental threat it poses to civil liberties and rights. Okay,
thank you. We have another question. This is from Gokul Krishnan, and I think, Jonathan, this is probably primarily for you. The question is, since many new algorithms are coming forward to be used in facial recognition systems, how can we understand which algorithm is better in a given context?
So one thing we do is we report performance on a number of different scenarios or cases. For example, mugshots in the wild. We do characterize performance by angle of pose. We are now coming up with a report, NIST itself, on the effect of bias and demographic performance. So these all go in, and this gives a scope of where performance is for any particular application. Is responsibility. If you want to know more detail of what's going on, they need to evaluate on data that goes with that. I also see here is do we consider things other than just accuracy and take computation consideration? When NIST reports, we do include computational times. We include the time it takes to compute, make comparisons, the amount of space, the template or encoding of it takes on disk space. So we do consider a much broader sense of what it means to deploy a system, not just accuracy, but also these other computational issues and some other deployment issues themselves, or not deployment, other issues that affect accuracy of its systems. And also the research community itself does publish and say, we have algorithms that are with this accuracy, but are faster. So the community as a whole does take into more than just the accuracy. They take in a lot of these other issues, including computation, amount of space it takes to store templates, and to give people an understanding of where the technology is.
Thank you. We've had a couple of comments which are really about scientific and social responsibilities of scientists and engineers and technologists. Tyrone Smith says that scientists have traditionally divorced themselves from the use of the technology they create. That should change. Those who create the technology should be held accountable for its use. And we also have a comment from John Murray, who says, how do we develop a stronger sense of professional ethics among computer scientists and software engineers, particularly on a global scale in the same way that medical professionals are educated to common codes of behavior? And I want to mention that there are efforts underway, the most significant of which I'm aware is one being undertaken by IEEE to address issues related to artificial intelligence broadly, including facial recognition, where they are looking at codes and standards. But that is not sufficient, as we all know, without there being some both way of educating and training those who are coming through the system, who will be the developers of these technologies, but also creating systems by which individuals are held accountable to those standards. So it's a significant work in progress. If that's an area that you're particularly interested in, I encourage you to email me, because it's one that we're going to be working on in the future in my program as well. And it leads to another question that we've received, and I pose it to each of you. Who should be held accountable for the misuse of facial recognition technology? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
So I sort of go back to the previous question a bit. So a lot of the issues, some of the fundamental things like bias and other issues came out of the research community themselves. Even the evaluations, the paper that started off the bias was a paper I did with colleagues that appeared at ACM, Transactions on Applied Perception, that first documented and brought to attention the issues of bias in facial recognition systems. So a lot of these issues now are very hot topics. ACM has a conference that works on this. IEEE, through their computer vision and pattern recognition series of conferences, had workshops on these. And each of these conferences, some of the best papers accepted are the best work in this area. So it's not that scientists are ignoring this. These are active areas of recognition that they do research to characterize it, to mitigate it. So the researchers are heavily engaged in solving these problems, doing research and characterizing it. And because the papers are published, it becomes more available to the public and the policymakers in how to adjudicate this and address it by informing their decisions or making data available themselves.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nima?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that both the developers and the person or the entity using the technology bear responsibility, right? Certainly, individuals who are putting this technology out there can't bury their head in the sands and pretend that misuses or uses that raise privacy and civil liberties concerns don't exist. And I think we ought to hold developers and companies responsible and pressure them to act more ethically and responsible when they think about not just what technology they're putting out there, but what uses and what entities are giving this technology to. For example, it's one of the questions that has come up in the broader debate about face recognition technology is, do certain companies sell to jurisdictions that have a history of discriminatory and problematic policing practices? And do they even do that analysis when they're deciding whether to approve a certain sale or enter into a contract? I think questions like that are ones that companies should be asking themselves, and they should be deciding and putting in place the protections to make sure their technology is not used. But of course, I think on the public policy side, we have to have laws and regulations in place that protect people's rights. From a government standpoint, prohibiting or putting in place a moratorium on face recognition technology. In the commercial privacy context, having restrictions on when private entities can collect your biometrics like face recognition and use those biometrics for maybe purposes that you didn't consent to or couldn't contemplate. And so there's both of those things, I think, are responsibilities that we have, but the companies and developers certainly have a role to play, I think, in this effort to make sure that the technology is not used in an unethical manner.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up on our last minute. We've had several comments come in, including about the moral responsibilities of scientists and ways in which they need help in thinking about whether to continue the research they're undertaking. We've had a comment from Vivian Lau about incorporating individual preferences into the deployment of such technologies. and how should collective citizens matter in the pace of facial recognition adoption. And an interesting question too, which we unfortunately won't have time to get to right now, but from Larissa Shelkin on AI and its use in K through 12 and words of wisdom for educators and high school students. We have less than a minute. I want to give each of you the opportunity for a final succinct thought, as short as you can, before we conclude this discussion. Nima, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I guess my short thought is that we ought to be thinking more about what we need to do to make sure that not just face recognition, but other biometric and surveillance technologies, what the process should look like before we put them out there. And making sure that we think about the effects from a privacy and civil liberties standpoint, not after the fact and not after harm has already been done, or where it's very difficult to sort of put the horse back in the barn, so to speak.
Thank you. Jonathan?
So I'll follow up on about just the AI course in K through 12. That's an opportunity to educate people about what the strengths and weaknesses of AI is in the future generation coming up. From my own personal point of view, I would love that my kids who went through school would walk out knowing something about AI when they got their high school diploma and were able to make informed decisions about the strengths and weaknesses and where they would like to see it in it.
Wonderful. Well, I want to wrap up this discussion first by thanking both of our guests, Dr. Jonathan Phillips and Ms. Nima Singh Guliani, and also to Hitachi for sponsoring the event. I hope that our audience will join us for the next in this series, which will focus on intelligent toys, and that will be held on October 8 at the same time, 12 noon Eastern. Thank you all very much.